You mentioned the covenant with Noah, and that's where I was going with this to begin with. Part of my hesitancy in years past with certain versions of 2K theology, and you call it an older version in the book, is that some people, maybe it's a caricature, maybe some people have advocated for this view, will tend to divide the mediation of Christ. Say Christ is the mediator, but he mediates the common kingdom through, this is very simplistic, but he mediates the common kingdom through general revelation and natural law. He mediates the special kingdom or the kingdom that'll last forever, the church, he mediates through special revelation. And that divide, I don't find it tremendously helpful. We'll get into other issues later, but I see a role for special revelation to the world. I see pre-redemptive special revelation in the Garden of Eden. We can talk about that. But what you've done here is you've moved from that. I'm not saying you were an advocate of that, but you've been very precise to root the mediation within the covenants. It's a covenantal perspective. Whereas we don't have one Christ, Lord of all, and he somehow is dividing up the world and doing different things in different ways, so much as we have an overarching covenant of grace instituted in Genesis 3:15, and then mediated successively through different administrations. That we have a unique common covenant with Noah that, in so many words, I'll just say, institutes common grace, and it restrains God's justice for a time so that his gracious purposes can go forth. God didn't come to the garden to destroy them. He held off his judgment, and then with Noah, after he destroyed the world by water, he promised, I'll never again destroy the world by water. And that's so that he can call all of his sheep, all the elect may be called in. And then once he does call them all in, he'll destroy the earth by fire and transform it and bring in the new heavens and the new earth. And so thinking of it that way, I think, is very winsome, at least to people who are persuaded of this covenant theology. Anyone who likes Meredith Kline ought to be, and I think is very compelling, and you do the exegetical work. So my point is to the listeners and to the viewers, there's something to reckon with here. And even if you don't like the term two-kingdom theology, think long and hard about what's going on with between the Lord and Noah, and what really are the implications of that. What does that mean for us in this world? And how ought we to relate to other people who are beneficiaries of common grace, yet may not be brought into the kingdom of Christ's church yet? So, run with that for a minute. Explain to me, build the case a little for the commonality of the Noahic Covenant and how that plays into, or how that informs the theological considerations of this book.
First thing I would add is that there are a lot of other Reformed theologians who have understood this Noahic Covenant as common. Gerhardus Voss did.
Yes.
Abraham Kuyper started his big volume on common grace with the Noahic Covenant. Herman Bavinck did, and you find older Reformed theologians as well. So I think it is. I think it's helpful. Not new. Right. I think it's helpful for people to know that even though I'm doing something with this that I don't know of any other previous Reformed theologian who's done exactly what I'm doing. I'm sort of taking this in some. I'm putting some new questions to it. But the view itself is not. It's not a new, unique.
It's not novel. The structure, the covenantal structure is there. It's well received. I think it's sound, and I think the way you develop it, it's quite interesting. But explain that to people.
So as I look at the text, between Genesis 8:21 through 9:17 or so, that covenant that we find there, it's clearly a universal covenant. It's made with not only all of Noah's descendants, but every living creature. It's made with the earth. It's made with summer and winter, seed time and harvest. And we also find that it is a preservative covenant. So it doesn't, this is something that I feel like I have to point out, is that it doesn't make any promises of redemption.
And there's no blood there.
There's no blood there. The rainbow is a non-bloody sign. What it promises is that God is going to preserve this world for a time in order that the human community might continue and grow, and that especially so that there might be a world to save, you might say. I mean, without this covenant, there would be no human race in which Christ could enter and enact the plan of salvation. So it's, I think this is important. To say that the Noahic Covenant is a covenant of common grace is not to say it's just disconnected from the covenant of grace. We can see how, in a sense, you couldn't even have the covenant of grace without this covenant of common grace, because the covenant of grace presumes that there's still a world, a fallen world, but a world that still exists. But that's not really my focus here. Right. My focus is to say, I think the Noahic Covenant as a common grace covenant is really important for thinking about political community in this world in which we live. In that, in this covenant, in this common grace covenant, God has, well, he's preserved a lot of things. I mean, he's preserved families. I mean, we see that in the Noahic Covenant. He says, be fruitful and multiply. So there's still family structures which are being acknowledged. But we see that there's a broader human community which is being preserved. And we see that there is that call to justice in the Noahic Covenant. He who sheds the blood of man, by man will his blood be shed. And that's a basic principle of justice, proportionate penalty, fitting penalty for wrong. And so there's a lot of argument here, obviously, but I try to root the institution of political community and government in particular in this covenant, and that provides this foundation for saying that it's a common covenant, and that these are common institutions, and that we as believers need to take that seriously, and to interact with unbelievers as fellow participants in this common grace covenant, accountable to God with them, alongside them, for these things. And my hope is that by talking about these things in covenantal terms primarily, that will be attractive to Reformed people especially. And as you probably noted, I mean, I use the language of two kingdoms very little in this book. And I mean, part of my hope is that covenantal language, it provides a more explicitly biblical exegetical grounding for it, and it just resonates with Reformed people.